you see the slides okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Good to meet you all. And although Jen said this will be formal, let's make it really informal. And I just want to share an approach we're taking with how to tell the climate change story. And that's through all the things shown right here. The foods we really care about, the foods we need. And then if we hear about the coffee and chocolate and so on, so I've even done op-eds myself on some of those topics, but when you put it all together, we really think it's the way to go. So just a little bit more about me. I'm a parent, so this is going to be a combination of just talking about the approach we're taking, but also just putting the story together. So why am I here today? Several years ago, a Cornell alum suggested I read this book on the left by James Lovelock, and that was kind of a turning point for me. I'm a parent. Anybody who's concerned about climate change should be concerned about the next generation. 2 daughters and a male that goes with one of the daughters. He's our son-in-law. We love him. I held a bunch of leadership roles at Cornell. And when you're in those kind of positions, you better be seeing the big picture. And climate change certainly falls there. I've spent time in California in the vast San Joaquin Valley, so I understand large-scale agriculture. At the same time, I came from a one-cow dairy in Wisconsin. Spent some time in that military organization in the middle, and that included a tour in Vietnam. And that comment right there carries a lot of weight with some audiences that otherwise might not listen. And I enjoy to eat and occasionally have a liquid beverage. So like they say in US Homeland Security, if you see something, say something. That's why I'm here. So telling this story about food, the audience we're focused on is rich countries. The US in particular, because cumulatively contributed more to climate change than most other countries. Everything is science-based. We're not pointing fingers, so there's no villains in the food system. And since many of you are teachers, my approach is, this is not yet used formally in a classroom, but there's so many teachable moments when you start talking about food, so many aha moments that I just think it's a really good way to go, but I'll let you be the judge. Okay, why food? We all eat. It gets over the psychological distance challenge of talking about climate change. It's relevant. No matter your age, where you live, it's part of our culture, it's family traditions, it's emotional. I sometimes say I cry after my partner makes a meal, but it's because it's so good. Those liquid beverages are social lubricants. It's important to the economy. Generally easy to talk about food, and the stories are unlimited. And part of the story is, where does it come from? We can all go to a store and get about just anything we want, but avocados, we import mostly avocados more avocados now from Mexico than ever before because California can't keep up with production. Coffee comes from around the world, teas from Asia, sushi rice, almost all sushi rice in the US comes from California. Cashews from Vietnam, bourbon from Kentucky, blueberries from Maine, or blueberries from Peru and Chile in our wintertime, but they're going to run out of water as the glaciers melt, the ice cap melts in the next couple of decades. Beef, if you like grass-fed beef, about 40% of our grass-fed beef comes from Australia. Fish sticks, another story. Fish are captured by the US fleet in the Bering Sea, shipped to China for processing into sticks and fillets, and then imported to the US. So just the story of where it comes from is pretty interesting. And I think there's another factor here, and that's the people. There's a farmer's market, so someone nearby produced those vegetables, the tomatoes. The gentleman in the middle is actually an Australian beef farmer, grass-fed beef. The family in the upper right, they're growing cacao for chocolate in Western Africa. They make all of $4 a day. The woman in the lower left is pollinating vanilla. It's all done by hand, most likely in Madagascar. One of the most dangerous jobs in the world is in the middle, fishing the Bering Sea, and farmers in the Midwest. But it's all changing. It's another story. Even getting it to our table, pictured on the bottom is the Panama Canal, which for a while, the upper lakes were dropping in amount of water because of a drought, so the big ships couldn't get through. You think of the recent incident in the Suez Canal, a lot more of that's going to happen in the future, and there's a great publication out of Chatham House on choke points that are just waiting to happen because of climate change. Maybe on the positive side, up above, I think you're all familiar with sea ice in the Arctic and how it's retreating every year and opening up new sea lanes such that I think you can move from Northern Asia to Northern Europe now. Once that's open, the route is about 40% shorter. So there's stories about getting it to our table. But let's look at what's happening to the plants we depend on for life. A plant requires air, carbon dioxide, water, warmth, soil, and sunlight. It's all changing except sunlight. The increases in CO2, beneficial to most crops, they grow faster or larger, but the consensus is going to be offset by higher temperatures and water stress. Although you will hear that argument, CO2 is beneficial, agriculture will produce more, et cetera. That's not the case. Lou Zizka, now at Columbia, has done a lot of work on weeds that become harder to control when growing under higher levels of CO2. He did this incredible study of collecting pollen from goldenrod from museums from 1849 to roughly the 1960s, or maybe more currently, but there was a decline in protein across those many years because presumably of increasing CO2, but he backed it up with controlled experiments. Human nutrition, I think you've heard of this, loss of protein, iron, zinc, in many crops, and decrease in vitamins. In rice, it'll decrease by mid-century. By vitamin Bs will decrease by 30% in about 30 years. There's all kinds of other effects, flavors and colors with changes in CO2. And it can get really complicated. Paper by Dong, a review paper, showed that between 8 and 59% higher concentrations of all these compounds in vegetables with increasing levels of CO2. And you will see me pick on kale on occasion because it's one of my daughters makes me eat it. And for that reason, I don't like it. But it'll actually become sweeter with increases in CO2. More stories. Water changing. The entire global water cycle is changing. Where it falls, when it falls, how it falls, more rain, less snow. And I already mentioned melting glaciers, but the loss of that the meltwaters from our glaciers and ice caps has huge implications around the world for agriculture, let alone hydroelectric power and water for communities and cities and people. Changes in temperature. We all think it's warming, but it's not that simple. Cool regions are warming faster than warm regions. If you think of latitude, that fits. Cold seasons are warming faster than warm seasons. US winters are warming twice as fast as summers. Nights are warming faster than days. And that has implications for rice yields. They actually decline with warming nights. The same applies to, I believe, potatoes. And an obvious one, we're getting more heat waves that it reduces yields of wheat and a variety of other crops. So little twists and turns here. I think you're aware of this image above where crops are essentially, the plant hardiness zones have moved one complete zone north. That's fairly obvious in the dark area at the top where the Canadians are now benefiting because they can grow new crops that have, because of the warming winters, things have shifted north. Peaches in the lower left, there were no Georgia There were no peaches from the peach state, Georgia, in 2017 because the preceding winter was too warm. They had about 85% loss in yield. Pistachios in the middle on the bottom, the California pistachio industry lost between $200 and $300 million in lost production because there simply weren't any pistachios, again, because the preceding winter was too warm. That happened again just a few years ago. And with warming winters, we essentially have increased frost-free season length. In other words, the growing season has gotten longer by roughly 10 days here and up to 20 days out west. And if you haven't seen this in ProPublica, this article, I strongly urge you to look at it. But at the top, it says today, the dark area that's bordered is most suitable today based on temperature and precipitation. And they have a term essentially for livability for us, but also where some of the crops are growing. And you look down at 2070, and you can see this whole region, sort of optimal area for people to live in and grow crops, shifts north dramatically. And now as I look at that, I guess they're okay, but you can only grow crops so far up into Canada because it becomes the soil isn't there and you've got a lot of rocks, but I think this map still fits that. Anyway, this whole article is actually also about just human migration because of climate change. I really encourage you to take a look. It came out, I think, September of last year. More changes. And in a story, you always have to, anytime I tell a climate change story, you got to put a little bit of humor in here, but melting glaciers are bad enough. The loss of coffee is downright terrifying. And I can't imagine a world without ice cream, but there would be darkness and chaos. But the heart of the story that we're telling is essentially a menu. And we start with before dinner drinks, salads, main courses, side dishes, desserts, and coffee. And it's not a story that is doom and gloom. We actually celebrate those nice beverages that we begin our meal with: wine, the beer, and distilled spirits. They're part of cultures. And let me talk a little bit about where's the stuff come from. Again, this is more focused. The earlier conversation I shared about where things come from was kind of broad. Now we're actually walking through a meal. And for example, in each of these categories of salads and mains, et cetera, for salad, for example, we picked olive oil and avocados, sort of to highlight those. For sides, it's potatoes, wheat, rice, and a couple other starches. And then we dig in. We celebrate them, talk about where they come from, who cares, and the top of the list are the people growing those crops for us around the world. Millions and millions of people are dependent on the income they get from growing our food. We talk about it's all changing because of climate change. And then what's being done and what can be done. Lots of solutions, again, for these specific sort of subgroups, such as olive oil, avocados, et cetera. So let's look at the menu, upper left. There is a story with, I'm gonna make a bet here, but I won't put any money down, that there's a story behind every bottle, mainly because these are water intensive industries. Gin, my favorite. Across all the brands, they use 150 different botanicals. Some of those are definitely changing. The salad, avocado production is going to drop by 40% in California in 20 years. Seafood, all kinds of changes there. I'm sure you're aware of that. Lower left, nutritional quality of wheat. Olive oil, I've mentioned, most of which comes from Spain, and they're stressed because of drought and high temperatures. There's a story behind garlic. You feed it to ruminants and they produce less methane. In the middle, chocolate, cacao comes from Western Africa, stressed there, vanilla, multiple stories there, lots with nut crops because of warmer winters. In the temperate parts of the world, like California, again, warmer winters are going to affect nuts, like I said, other nuts, like I mentioned already, pistachios. And the one in the lower right, I don't want to talk about, but coffee we know is in trouble for a variety of reasons. So what if you're telling a story to someone much younger? And you start, instead of those beverages, with chocolate milk. The main course might be a hamburger. This happens to be a meatless hamburger, but there's multiple stories there. I'm not sure if I see an onion in there in a burger, but onions are going to get more pungent in time because of increases in CO2. Potatoes, I'm sure French fries would be preferred here. And in fact, in the UK, a few years ago, their chips, they're equivalent to our French fries, were shorter because of a drop in high temperatures. Stories there. Salads, a lot of lettuce comes from Salinas Valley in California. They're going to have to be really careful. One, because of water constraints, and two, high temperatures actually burn the tips. They get tip burn, so they have to check varieties. And finally, dessert. Chocolate, milk for ice cream. Cows give less milk. The cherry on top, again, fruit trees are susceptible to warm winters. Nuts are in there. There's more stories. Sugar, sugar's probably going to be okay, but sugar beets, especially in Europe, are going to start experiencing drought and loss in yield. Sugarcane in general will probably be okay for the coming decades. Okay, another approach to this, and again, anybody can do this if you've got a smartphone, but you make a list of your favorite foods, or beverages. Mine are here. And for any one of those, you do a search, climate change, and up will come a story. So there's my son-in-law again, drinking a kale beverage of some kind, which he isn't pleased with. But this is another approach, and it's pretty amazing. If you just pick random ingredients and do a search for climate change, and I would say at least half the time there's a story there. And here's a whole other realm of stories to tell. Think about all the other plant-based products we have in our daily life. Pet food, it's also made with grains and meat. Lots of stories there. Cotton, climate change, especially drought and high temperatures, resins and dyes, perfumes. Several stories out of France about the natural-based perfume suffering because the flowers are suffering. Flavors, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, medicinal herbs. Many of these are collected at higher elevations from the wild. Well, clearly things are changing in our mountainsides and elsewhere. And as I showed earlier in the slide with the young lady who was just overwhelmed by all the changes happening in vegetables because of CO2, it does affect phytochemicals in all of these food-based industries and can have an effect. More stories. And a reality check. Okay, again, our audience is US in particular, but I think we're all aware if you live resources to adapt. It's a food security challenge and a moral challenge. Just a quick aside, these are pictures I took when in Vietnam, one of my last trips, and it's just a world on water. And I was just overwhelmed by how resilient the farmers were there and switching to various crops, et cetera. They were going to make it. So we can all get depressed, overwhelmed by this. One way to deal with that is do something and act. So more stories. So how do we save the foods we love and need? You give all of us hope. I said there are no villains in this story. So we refer to farmers as stewards of the land. And the approach being promoted now globally is climate smart farming, where they focus on soil health, water, and pest management have to be at the top of the list. Diversification, so that in case some of your crops are wiped out, you still have others for an income. Try to minimize livestock stress, in particular from heat, and also long-term planning so that you can stay in business for the long term. Food and beverage industries, we all have a long way to go, but they are also, some of the big industries are investing a lot of money in their supply chains. They're investing in the farmers wherever they are around the world to help them produce the product they need so they can stay in business. There's a lot of stories about energy conservation, even in the distilled spirits industry, where they're switching to lighter bottles, less glass, et cetera. And some are looking at alternative ingredients, including Ben & Jerry's and their ice creams. And to me, this is really an exciting part of the story because we can make an attempt to connect science to the food we all enjoy and eat. And we have to invest in resilient crops. And some of these things I said already: soil health, management of pest and water, decision tools for farmers around the world, when to irrigate, when not, when to maybe control a pest or not. The science of communication is so important, economics, and then obviously just being reducing our emissions and renewables. But the science is behind all of this. And it's an opportunity to just share this story with, let's say, the consumers. And specifically, let's look at genetic engineering. It is hard to find a package of processed stuff, food, without the term non-GMO on it. But this is an image actually from the book. And it shows a piano keyboard with 32,000 keys, if you imagine it going off into the horizon. Well, and one key is being removed. Well, it's like removing a single gene from the 32,000 in a corn plant. We're trying to help the reader, the viewer, understand, have a little bit better understanding of what gene editing in this case is all about. And we stress, according to the NAS, there's no substantial evidence that foods from GE crops are less safe than food from non-GE crops. There's the science. And obviously what we can all do: become climate change literate, tell this story, talk about climate change. I think we're all familiar with Katharine Hayhoe, how to start changing things or improving things about climate change, start talking about it. We encourage a more plant-based diet. Specifically, we suggest treating red meat as a delicacy, not a staple, rather than just shutting people off and saying, stop eating red meat. Reduce food waste, assess your entire carbon footprint. It's not just food. And respect and support those who supply the menu. That's the farmer, that's the scientist, and all the others in the food system. So the message we are trying to convey is about climate change broadly, but we're using food to do so. And to keep that food on the table, we have to address climate change. I'm sure you're all aware of recommendations about talking about it, but a lot of people, well, we know from the Yale surveys, just a few, what, 1/3 of the population occasionally talks about climate change. But this is part of the story. And down at the bottom is, what if you use food to start that conversation? Once one has a full, maybe a better appreciation for all that's changing, you can sit down at a table with others. Well, I picked up a menu and in 10 minutes, I identified 26 food ingredients that were changing. It's pretty straightforward, lots of stories to tell. So again, we're trying to raise awareness and action through food. It's relevant. Think of all of those involved: the consumers, the chefs, the restaurateurs, the food industries, the producers. Can we, this is our sort of our aspiration, find common ground across the entire food supply chain and create a climate change social movement driven by food? So we have a book. There's a cover on the left. myself, Harry Kaplinka-Lair, and Danielle Eisman. It's illustrated by an undergrad at Cornell University. There's a gigaton of ice with the Empire State Building. I sent her a boring bar graph of why people drink coffee, and that's what came back, upper right. I think it's 62% like the taste and 58 wakes me up. I was just amazed at how someone can be creative and take a bar graph and do that. We depict the troposphere as the peel of an apple, shown lower down, and at the bottom, it's land required to produce a unit of protein. And you can see that beef and mutton require quite a bit, less so for wheat and corn, etc. But again, very simple, very easy messages to convey when drawn out like this. We also have a website. It's called Just Our Changing Menu. It's a living version of the book, so we can keep things updated, and they are happening fast. But it's kind of a mini version of the book that can be kept up to date. It includes an ingredient database. In time, this database, I hope, will contain several hundred different food ingredients and a story for each. I've had feedback from chefs who think this is really something they could use. But each of these is a story, like abalone along the West Coast, anchovy populations are moving. There's a lot of stories behind spices and herbs, in particular from India. So we're working on this. We're continuing to make progress. I think we probably have about 100 ingredients in now, but this could be greatly expanded. And the plant-based product database is still in its infancy. There's actually no examples there yet, although we have a student working on it. But again, pharmaceuticals, clothing, perfumes, pet food, toothpaste, you name it. There's something plant-based, a plant of some form in many of these products, and they're changing. So taking it all together, Our Changing Menu, Climate Change and the Food We Love, the book, the website. There are 2 students working on social media to get the word out. Hopefully by the end of the week, we'll have funding for a messaging experiment, because everything I'm telling you, there's not a lot of research saying that you can use food to change human behavior. You know, can you try and change your buying practices? But hopefully in a couple of months, we'll have results of that. And we'll have hopefully definitive information on, can food actually be used to affect and bring about action? We've got a comedian in Chicago working with chefs on humor. That'll end up on the website. There's a gentleman interested in producing milk for us, music for us related to climate change. We're dreaming about a documentary film. We got a couple other things. This is NYPA is the New York Power Authority. We're engaged. This is sort of a separate effort in training their 2,300 employees about climate change. I'm currently teaching a eCornell course, which is for middle-level executives, but it seems like there's a lot of interest, and enrollment just doubled for the course starting tomorrow. And again, can we in fact create a social movement using food? And I'm just going to use a quote from Bill McKibben: "Push for change is big enough to matter, and food matters." Thank you. I'm back.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much for sharing. And I think there might be some questions happening in the chat. And Frank, I see you've got your hand up, so why don't you kick us off?
Mike, I love to see the progress. I remember you telling us about things were coming, but now that you're here, When is, two questions. The simple one is, when do you think this is gonna be published?
Well, the book is published, it's out.
Oh, it is published, it's already out. Okay,
Yep.
That's great. So the second question is, you know, one of the things that we're struggling with this incredibly important topic and your approach is, you know, that ProPublica slide, which shows, you know, future food ranges and habitability and all that. That's the RCP 8.5, but the international community is working incredibly hard to not make that future. And we're trying to make a different future that is much lower carbon load, much more less intensive carbon pathway. So how you handle which future food is, it's changing, but which future, how much more change? Can you talk a little bit about how you talk about like connecting the carbon reductions to protecting the foods you love in the book?
Well, the last chapter is on solutions, and we encourage people to become activists, to truly engage. It's political, get political. So we really encourage, you know, those big actions, not just eat less meat. But the real, let's see. I mean, I'm astounded at even professional colleagues of mine. I'll use an example. Somebody I work with, they just had excuse me, this is one of those tough ones, but they just had a baby. And he said, Mike, I'm really worried about my child. And I looked at him and said, I think a lot of awareness still needs to occur, and that's the message, and trying to get people to act using food. No, I know, well, the book covers, you know, okay, in 20 years, Peru is going to be out of the ice cap and blow on, so on and so forth. And it's just in an aggregate, it's an aggregate story that frankly is scary, but we're not telling them it's scary. We want it to sort of be organic, and then it's a wake-up call. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think the goal is awareness and get people to act.
I guess the point I'm trying to get at is that if we're looking at a range of futures,
right,
in a way that humans have never looked at before. We've never been the architect of our future before as a species with intention. This is what science gave us the opportunity to do. And the Paris Agreement gives us a pathway to, if we do this, we get that outcome. If we do this, or basically the status quo, we get that. And that's something we really want to avoid. But what your book does is says, the things you love, the things you rely on, the things that you interact with in a daily way are threatened in a way that you're probably completely unaware of. And the only way to protect these things actually is choosing this carbon pathway, right, and these other activities. But if you don't do this, and I'm just wondering how it's a complicated story to tell. And I'm just wondering how you did it in the book. I'm eager to explore it in myself,
well, there's a whole chapter on climate. There is a chapter simply on like climate change 101. And I talk about the Paris Agreement and 2 degrees and 1.5 and so on. So I think, and that essentially sets the stage before you go into the menu. So that's probably what we're after. All right, to answer your question, I think it's in there.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Chini, you have your hand up too. Go ahead.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much for your work. I'm currently writing some curriculum for a high school in the Bronx around food systems. And your book is going to be really helpful, so thank you. The 2 big questions I have, and maybe this already shows up either in your book or your website, is one, do you do any work around either centering or acknowledging indigenous knowledge in relation to food? That feels really important to me. And it's something I'm just starting to kind of, I'm by no means an expert, but that feels really important to talk about or tell a story about. And then the second question, I like the database on your website. Do you have any other resources that make it possible for kids, high school, middle school, elementary school kids, to do their own research and inquiry around food that they love or food that they need in kind of an accessible way? So it's not just the teacher telling them this is how food is going to be impacted, but they can do their own research. And does that question make sense?
Yeah, and I because of my virtual background there, can you see this thing?
Yes.
I mean, it's my iPhone. Type in a food. I mean, have anybody do that. Type in their favorite food and see what comes up. I mean, you say,
yeah,
whatever, climate change and bananas or something like that.
Yeah.
I think that could be very informative for anybody.
Yeah.
So that's one approach. And then back to your first question about, so you're talking about indigenous traditions and food production. That was your question.
Yeah, indigenous knowledge, indigenous relationship to food and nourishment. They have a lot to say and have had a lot to say for a long time, but haven't been like listened to or as centered. And so I think if there are ways to kind of bring indigenous voices into the conversation or the storytelling, that can only to kind of reorient. And I think that also goes along with some of the it wouldn't be environmental racism, but like the different types of access to food, like in urban environments. I think all that feels like really important to the conversation, and wondering if it shows up either in your book or on your website.
Not to a great extent. This might be a stretch for some people, but having grown up on a farm and sort of been through all of that, a little farm where we were pretty much grew the food we needed. I have an appreciation for what it takes to grow food and be dependent on it. And that message does come through. I mean, we talk about the family in Western Africa, you know, I think if it's a laborer, you're making $2 a day and a family makes 40. But the point that, it's not exactly what you're after, but I showed that one picture of the Aussie growing beef in Australia and so on. So it's kind of woven through where does it come from? And there's typically a story about, oh, excuse me, I should read the book. There's a series of personal interviews in the book of people on the front line, like a consultant helping coffee growers. He was with a faith-based group for a while, now he's switched, but helping coffee growers switch to cacao. There's the story of a sheep farmer at the headwaters of the Colorado River in Wyoming. He's got all kinds of awards for sustainability. And part of the story is they can no longer ride horse in the forest because of the dead trees from the bark beetles. It's not exactly what it does put a human side to it. It's not exactly what you're after, but some of those stories are like that. There's two stories about, one is a woman who captures lobsters off of the Maine coast, and she's diversifying. She's also producing oysters, just to have an income because of what's happening to the lobster population. So in a way, it does touch on it, but it's not exactly what you're after. And I'm also, I guess I'll stop there. That's as close as we're getting in the stories.
Thank you very much.
And I see Eric and Laura, so Eric, with their hands up. So go ahead, Eric.
Sorry about that. I think Laura might have been next, but Laura, do you want to go or either way? Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate your approach too with the idea of telling the story of not only where's our food coming from, how the climate's changing that, but the people that are growing it. And I feel like a lot of the things we've been talking about in Clean over the last year that I've been part of the group have to do with this idea of these stories of resilience and kind of Cheney's point about bringing in a much more diverse community to sort of tell that story and understand the story and history of resilience, where we get a lot of our understanding about how to grow food. So I sort of feel like the logical next step, and I appreciate the humor approach a lot too, because I definitely embed that in a lot of things that I do, including a workshop I just did this last Saturday on using composting and worms as a way to combat climate change and build healthy soil and lower carbon footprints. But so I think that's like the logical next step, is teasing out stories of resilience across the globe, you know, and where, so because kind of to Frank's point, we have a diverging potential future. We don't know where we're going to end up, but we want to catalyze action. We don't want to shut down the younger generation. So that's the balance of telling the story. We know there's inertia in the pipeline. We know these changes, like the glaciers melting. We know that there's a lot of inertia and that there will be change. And yet there's this divergent future potential scenarios. So how do we sort of build resilience, build understanding of the science, you know, brace people, especially the younger generation, for change, and have them internalize that the future is not set in stone, and that they can build their own personal resilience, you know, along this path. Because that's, you know, personally, that's kind of been my transition from sort of the gloom and doom kind of approach to changing the narrative for the younger generation, and through storytelling, and through storytelling from folks with diverse backgrounds. That we know that there are certain populations that are much more food insecure and much more at risk. So start there with their stories of resilience and their stories of urban farming and community gardens, and, you know, sharing food across a community in a food desert, for example. So there's just so much to unpack there to build towards this positive kind of a future potential. So appreciate your work, and just that's sort of where I'm seeing my head go when I hear what you're working on.
I mean, there's many examples in the book about I'll pick on coffee, but it's, you know, shade grown coffee and the benefits of that, and the benefits of increased bird populations feeding on coffee borers. And so it's, that's essentially one section to every story in the menu. There is, you know, what is being done. And a lot of that is being done by farmers. And I talk about cover crops and, you know, all of those things that are the stewards of the land, wherever they are, doing. So there's a lot of that in there in the book. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Laura?
Hi. I just wanted to share one thing that we're doing at our Music and Learning Festival that is an intersection of climate change and agriculture. I'm pretty excited about this topic. We're going to have a topic called homesteading carbon. And the idea comes from this farm in Tennessee called Caney Fork Farms. And actually it happens to be Al Gore's family farm that he's now turned into Agriculture Research Center, the intersection of agriculture and climate change. And their livestock rotation and their farming methods are directly developed to draw carbon into the soil. So what they're going to present on at our festival is comparing the amount that they can do with their large scale farms as to what you can do in your backyard or your small scale farm. Because when you put all those different small scale farms together, you have a footprint that's just as large or bigger than a large scale farm that homesteads carbon.
Well, actually, there's quite a bit of information also in the book about all the options for grazing cattle, like silviculture, rotation, and feeding high protein, high nutrient forages and so on to minimize, well, basically to get to the point where you're at, trying to return the carbon that you're kind of like a net zero in the end, yet you're also producing an animal. Thanks for sharing that.
Great. Well, we just have maybe 5 minutes left. Are there other questions or comments or thoughts around this approach and framing to talking about climate change? Oh, Laura, did your hand go back up?
Yes.
Okay, great. Go.
Let's see. You were sharing, Mike, you were sharing that information about where your food comes from. And I did graduate studies in geography, particularly human geography. And that is a classic task in an introductory to human geography class. It's where it comes from a scholar named David Harvey out of England. And the title of it is, Where Does Your Breakfast Come From? Right. So not only are you talking about the physical geographical components, but you're also talking about supply chains and logistics, and you're also having to deal with the economic components of the whole production process. And my students really got into it. And in fact, one student was so intrigued by it that he tried to call and locate the specific factory where the wheat was ground. And the company had a feeling he was like an Earth First activist that was going to come down and blow up the factory.
We have been asked if we could add another column to the food ingredient database such that it would identify, say, the carbon footprint. And it's close to impossible to do that because of transportation, storage, refrigeration, where is it grown, how is it grown? That might be something in the future, but that's a really difficult one to answer. Mm-hmm. Obviously, if it's grown in your garden, that's one thing, but if the rest of the food, much more challenging.
Mike, oh, sorry.
You go, Cheney.
Mike, I could imagine at the end of a unit in high school, middle school, elementary, where students create some kind of project or menu. Are there ways for kids to kind of get involved either in your website or like for them, once they do some of this work or have like a project or learning that they've done, are there ways that you can imagine them getting involved or furthering their work, especially if they're really passionate about it?
That's something I've not thought about.
Okay.
But let me offer the following experience. We have 3 Cornell undergrads working on, 1 on the plant-based database and 2 on the food database. And it's actually difficult for them because 1, there's so much information out. Even if you pick 1 ingredient, you're going to find 10 stories. What's the most important? What's going to have the greatest impact on the reader? Making sure it's science-based, and then trying to just write that in a couple paragraphs. I mean, it takes me a lot of time. So my point is that we're not going to go there because it's really challenging. I'm actually I'm recruiting Cornell retirees, some faculty maybe that might do this. But no, to answer your question, just, again, the focus is on, to be blunt, adults in the US and other rich countries. So we haven't done that. It doesn't mean there could be opportunities there. I'd be happy to entertain something if you got an idea. The website is live. It's going to always be evolving and growing. So we could put something in there if that might be appropriate for a younger audience. Happy to consider that. Good idea.
So Mike, one thing that I found over the years is intergenerational dialogue is an incredibly powerful, underutilized tool in all of our efforts. And that, as you know, young people have a funny way of holding us to our statements in action. So, in schools, when you think about schools, the health class is an interesting class to think about in the context of this conversation, because we tend to focus on the science classroom. I'm like, that's so 2007. It's important, but it's not the only place where this is going to show up in a school or in a learning environment. So I think that, adding an intergenerational dimension to this is, I would highly recommend. And then looking at the other parts of a learning ecosystem, and then probably are already there, but that I've got deep appreciation of that intergenerational dialogue piece. It's super powerful and deeply underutilized.
Good point. Thank you.
Sure.
I think we're at time, but I just chatted in because I've been hearing this statistic about school bus. I'd never thought about it before. That the school bus fleet's the largest automotive fleet in the world, in the US at least. But school cafeterias would probably fall under the category of the largest restaurant in the world. So if you could change that, you could change everything, maybe.
Well, I have a lot of interest from Cornell chefs, and they serve 24,000 meals a day. So I think there's more than a nugget of interest there. They really want to participate. And we're going to have a Zoom pretty soon with a bunch of them. I was their keynote speaker last year and they just loved it. But yeah, I think there's all of those situations. Well, I've got contacts in the restaurant business and outside of Cornell chefs who just find this intriguing. And I'm really trying to get in touch. I even gave their executive chef a free copy of the book signed in one of our major food retailers. What a potential teachable moment to have some kind of messaging in a very, very big food retailer. Yeah.
I know some folks are popping off, but I just saw Art, your hand go up. So please jump in. And I know folks have to go, please head out, but thanks for just sticking with us a little longer.
Yeah, this is just a quick thing. There's a Center for Ecoliteracy in Berkeley, California, and they've done quite a bit about school lunches and food and education.
What's it called? Sorry?
Center for Ecoliteracy.
Okay.
They're amazing. I know about them. Their materials are excellent.
Great.
That's a great reminder about that resource, actually.
Jen, I'm going to just throw this question out. It's not related to this conversation. And if we don't have time to discuss it, so I'm just, if that's all right.
Sure.
I keep thinking, dreaming, I've drafted a syllabus for a course called Climate Change in Your Future for college students. And our students are screaming for something like that. They want to know what to do. And I think a course like that could offer them, what's happening in the world of law, what's happening in, activism, et cetera, even help with careers. One unit, no prerequisites, any major, but just to introduce them and give them something to grasp about what they could do about their future. Just quick reactions to that. I'm looking for someone else or somehow to develop this nugget into something a little more serious. I've got interest from the Europeans even. When I asked this question at the European Geophysics, whatever, union presentation, they all went, yes, we need that. So I guess maybe I'll just stop there, but I just think we have a moral obligation to help them get prepared for whatever lies ahead.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I don't know if anyone's read the Christina Kwok's latest briefing from the Brookings Institute about her, the idea of having a climate action project happening in every school in the world. Mm-hmm. And that, and I think this could apply not just to K-12, but also universities. If you think about harnessing student energy, and I mean, we do this through our youth climate summits, and it's like, student-driven student action, where they're actually making a difference in their schools or communities by creating a plan that they're passionate about, and then they're taking that to the next level. So she actually wrote about this concept at like a really big scale, obviously from a global scale, but this is kind of to what you're saying, like people want, like, they need direction and they need help thinking about like, well, what can I do? And what can we do? Like, moving from that me to we concept and collective action. But anyway, I think it's a great idea. We need more of that.
I mean, the many students working with us on the website, they're just like, wow, I've always wanted something to do and this is it. I can help. So there. Okay, thank you.
Sure. I think we'll probably wrap it up there. Thanks again, Mike, for sharing your work, and congratulations to you and Danielle and everybody who's been working really hard on the project. I can't wait to check the website out more. And thanks to everybody for attending and staying with it. And I know Katie, or probably Katie, will get this posted to the CLEAN website soon.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.